Blood Packets by D.H. Dunn. Narrated by Amy Kaczynski. Looking over her shoulder into the dark shadows of New Portland's Monument Street for the 10th time, Alex fumbled for her cell phone with one hand while banging the old church door's heavy knocker with the other. No one gets Alex Queen in trouble more than Alex Queen, her mother often told her. As the freezing rain ran down her fingers, she had to admit this was a damn typical example. The wind rose up, pushing the rain sideways, stabbing into her like tiny needles. The brass of the knocker was slippery and cold, a perfect description of her evening. Here she was, outside an abandoned church in an early December downpour, in the worst part of town, to perform the most unusual and frankly sketchy job she'd ever been offered. A perfect Alex Queen moment. It would be enough to make most people laugh, but laughing wasn't her style. After all, nothing kicked common sense's ass like a scared kid and an impatient landlord. Maybe that's why she said yes to this job when every sensible instinct she had told her to say no. Of course, it didn't hurt that the offer had been delivered by a man with crisp blue eyes and a disarming smile. "I'm looking for Alex Queen." His voice was a mixture of worry and desperation. "Is he here?" Well, that was never new. She had explained in a routine so familiar she barely needed to fire a synapse to speak it that she was Alex Queen. Yes, she was a female network engineer. Yes, this was her consulting service. And yes, she actually knew what she was doing. Her prospective client seemed satisfied with her response and even apologized for his mistake, a blush coming to his cheeks. He introduced himself as Stefan, his nervous handshake displaying nearly as much anxiety as Alex felt herself. Whoever this poor man was, he was clearly under a lot of pressure. Stefan explained he worked for something called the Antica Group, and that they had an urgent job for her, some sort of product launch. Alex could see through the desperation in the man's eyes that they were out of options. They had to be, or they wouldn't be talking to her. His questions continued. Could she handle multiple issues? Could she come tonight? And could they pay her in cash? Red flags fired left and right. Alex ignored them. The cash, up front even, was too important. Here, in one night, she could clear 3 months' rent. 3 months without sleepless nights, trying to figure out which bills to pay, clipping coupons, or wondering if she really needed lunch. With this one job, it would be 3 months of a life in striking distance of normal for her in Austin. Maybe she could even take him out for a kid's meal every now and then. She accepted on the spot. She had pushed the stack of books out of the way of her desk and allowed the man to write down her instructions. Gazing through strands of dark hair still damp from the rain, he cast a curious eye at the collection of cake decorating guides and magazines. It's for my son," she had said, laughing nervously. "His birthday is coming up, and I wanted to make a cake, and—" She trailed off, and had been grateful he had let her. He didn't need to hear about her 10 failed attempts to make a Thomas the Tank Engine cake for Austin, or how nervous she was about the 11th. It would be her son's 5th birthday next week, and his 2nd without Danny. She wanted desperately for it to be special, but wanting something didn't always translate to a recognizable train on a cake. When Stefan handed her the address, letters and numbers hastily scratched on a crumpled piece of paper, her heart had stopped. She needed the job. She'd have taken it no matter where it was. Yet the location added a new layer of emotion to the task, like fog rolling in from the lake. 47 Monument Street. It might as well have been written in neon as it burned through her mind, searing into her thoughts while she drove in the cold rain. This address, this place, this church. As a girl, she had skipped rope in front of these worn granite steps. Here she had her first communion, first confessional. She said a complicated goodbye to her father kneeling in its pews. Inside these walls, she had told Danny she loved him under the watchful eyes of God. It was here she dipped Austin's tiny head below holy waters, believing at the time that she had saved his soul. She hadn't stepped through the doors since that windy April day, both 5 and 1,000 years ago. Alex and God were no longer on speaking terms, not since Danny left and everything went so wrong. When the church closed last year, she thought she didn't care. Yet here she was, with her damp laptop bag over her shoulder in the pouring rain, banging on the old brass knocker once more. She checked the time on her phone, huddling against the wind to try and keep the screen dry. 9:15. Damn it! She had wanted to say good night to Austin, ask him how kindergarten was, just hear his voice. It felt like days since she had seen him. Mom was diligent, though. 9 p.m. bedtime meant 9 p.m. If she called now, she'd only get Mom and all the usual questions and comments. That was not a conversation she had the strength for. She flipped the phone over, hoping to pull strength from the small drawing she had laminated onto the back. Austin's scribbled artwork, a sailboat with himself in the middle, flanked by Alex and Danny on either side. She felt a small flash of anger run through her as she looked at the tiny crayon man standing next to her son. Danny, who couldn't manage to make one child payment out of 3, got to be on the boat with her and her baby. Fortunately, she supposed he was only on the drawing now. The door creaked open, casting the church vestibule's amber into the rain. Alex shoved her phone into her pocket and nearly dropped her bag when she saw Stefan was there, waiting for her by the door, hugging it almost, his sleek black suit now covered with a tan raincoat. He smiled at her as he fixed his long dark hair with one hand, holding the door open for her with the other. "Apologies for the wait, Miss Queen," he said, his friendly smile contrasting with his worried brow. "I was downstairs. Please come in out of the rain." Alex stared back at the man, dumbfounded. How could he be here already? There was no faster way from her office to the church in the Downs, nothing even close. No buses ran here, and there were no trolley stops nearby. Even the taxis weren't likely to venture this far into her neighborhood. Stefan would have faced the same traffic she did coming from uptown, and he had still been at the office when Alex had left. If Stefan could read her confusion, he didn't show it. The man simply smiled, his dark hair contrasting with his bright eyes, and followed her as she stepped inside the old structure. "Your data center is inside a church?" Alex asked, rain pouring from her coat in thick streams, pooling on the grungy red carpet beneath her. She'd seen the moving trucks rumble down the street a few weeks past. A nice sunny Saturday with her and Austin sitting on the steps of the brownstone watching the pigeons. At the time, she had been happy to see something going into the old building, lest it become just one more hollowed-out shell in the neighborhood, one more step in the wrong direction for the Downs. "In the basement, actually," Stefan replied, taking off his coat and hanging it inside the dark wood of the vestibule. "After the unpleasant incident last year, we found the asking price to be quite reasonable," he continued, leading Alex into the warmth of the main chapel. The room still retained some of its former piety, brightly colored carpet and curtains struggling for joy against the dim light and shadows. The crosses and other religious markings were all missing, leaving barren holes on the walls and gaps in the paint. The empty pews lined up one after another like rows of gravestones. "Incident? That's one way of putting it," Alex said, noting the brown paper covering the stained glass windows as they walked between the pews toward the altar. "My memory is that they found the pastor burned alive right there on the dais, Mr. Stefan." Around the neighborhood, the impact of Father Brennan's death sent tremors through every family in the Downs. The closure of the church a few months later had merely been the final aftershock, trembles running through a community that had seemed too damaged to crumble further, but found a way all the same. Perhaps the Antigua group was here to turn that around, one positive step against the tide. Alex did her best to balance her hope against the cynicism her mother had taught her. If this company wanted to appear on the up and up, paying cash for urgent midnight network repairs was not a good start. Stefan paused for a moment at the dais, stopping to run his hand along the still purple fringe of the altar. The man gave his back an odd twist as he looked back at her, but offered no other reply. Holding a lush red curtain open to reveal the antechamber behind the altar, he ushered Alex through to the other side. The anteroom was smaller and considerably darker than the main hall of the church, lit only by a single electric candle, the same kind with the flickering orange light that would decorate Alex's mother's house every Christmas. Alex made note of various sheets, vestments, and other churchly artifacts strewn about, but just as in the church itself, no crosses. A silly observation, she told herself. Here she was, going down into the basement of a building with a strange man who paid her in cash, and the item she noted was the lack of crosses. The far wall contained a single door, number padlocked like many data centers Alex had visited. The door was thick, but not so thick she could not already hear the hum of equipment below. As Stefan keyed the code behind his shielded hand, Alex pondered the job itself. Her rushed web research on Antica had uncovered very little. A sparse website announced they were developing the foodstuffs of the future, but offered no real detail and no contact information. She supposed they were in stealth mode like many startups, unwilling to reveal any secrets save to rich investors, buried behind contracts and NDAs. Still, putting your data center in the basement of a church seemed like some nuclear-level stealth mode. The narrow stairway down was short, and after a few carpeted steps and a second door, Stefan brought Alex into the data center proper. If it had once been a church basement, it was hard to see that now. In fact, with the dim, crimson-tinted lighting, Alex had to wait for her eyes to adjust before she could really see anything. It was a cramped, shadowed room, primarily filled with long rows of equipment cabinets, aligned one after another like dominoes waiting to fall. Thin, narrow alleys ran between the cabinets like city back streets, hundreds of network cables snaking back and forth like webbing, their jacks inserted into thousands of flickering connections. All told, Alex counted 8 rows of metal equipment cabinets, each row about 10 cabinets deep. The hum that she heard upstairs was much louder here, with the churning of hundreds of fans from servers, switches, and routers trying to deal with all the room's high temperature. There was too much heat here, far too much. A data center of this size should be chilly, yet Alex found herself stripping off her hoodie instinctively to allow herself some air, lukewarm channels of stale breeze wafting over her neck and arms around her t-shirt. "It's too hot in here," she said, more to the room than Stefan. Every one of these machines must be dancing on the edge of overheating. Antica didn't need her, they needed an air conditioning technician. Stefan sat down by a small metallic desk by the door. The desk was bare, with no phone, laptop, or any other materials. He turned his gaze toward Alex, eyes narrowing. "Miss Umbra should be down the end of the far row of cabinets. She understands the technical natures of the problem." Alex shook her head. She could feel every bad instinct she had screaming at her. Something was odd about this whole setup. The room was too hot for this equipment to even be working, the lighting was too low for anyone to see what they were doing, and something needed to give. "First, I want the rest of my money," she said, keeping her feet bolted to the floor. She tensed a hip, ready to pivot back to the door and up the stairs. She put her hand out to Stefan. "Now." A feminine cough came from the shadowed rows of equipment, barely loud enough to register over the roar of 1,000 spinning fan blades. Stefan looked away from Alex, peering into the darkened reaches of the data center. He nodded after a moment and opened his drawer, handing her the envelope inside. Alex grabbed the cash out of the envelope quicker than she would have liked. Taking a breath and holding in the dry, heated air, she forced herself to count it slowly. Just because they were desperate, there was no need to let them know she was, too. As a trickle of sweat rolled down her cheek, she held back a relieved sigh. It was enough to cover them until winter. There, in the folder paper of her hand, was the most precious commodity of all. Time. Hearing the footsteps behind her, she quickly shoved the cash into her pocket. It would be a fast job, she reminded herself. One and done, and she'd be out. Who cares how creepy the whole setup was? Austin needed her. Turning, she found herself looking up at her client. The pale woman was tall, so tall that Alex wondered if she often hit her head on the dim lights of the ceiling. Her height, combined with her thin frame and dark, pulled-back hair, gave her an almost spider-like appearance, a creature of long limbs and tiny eyes. She angled toward her, the low light gleaming off her pale face. Clad in an elaborate dark suit that had to make her 20 degrees hotter, Ombra's grin did nothing to lower the chills running up Alex's spine. She took an instinctive step back, immediately frustrated that she did so. "Miss Queen," the woman said, her vibrating voice almost in sync with the whine of whirling fans, her words more blown out of her mouth than spoken. "You are not what I expected." The woman cast a baleful eye toward Stefan, who slunk into his chair further, collapsing under the weight of her gaze. Ombra's smile did not waver. "You expected a man." Alex fought the urge to put her hands on her hips. It wasn't a question, and the look on Ombra's pale face showed she recognized it. "In truth, yes," she said, frowning slightly. "But I suppose I am not keeping with the times. Expectations can be an odd thing. I expected a man from Timecast Cable as well. 3 times we had appointments." Ombra brandished a trio of long, bony fingers at Alex. 3 times I changed my plans to accommodate. He did not show up. I suppose the gender of Steve from Timecast will be forever a mystery. You, at least, are here. For now, Alex thought to herself, taking another look at the heavy door to the stairs. It seemed farther away now, though it was still only 10 or so paces back to the desk where Stefan sat. He watched Ombra out of the corner of his eye while chewing on one long nail. "Allow me to escort you to the problem in question, Miss Queen." Ombra brought one long, spider-like arm around Alex's back, guiding her forward with a gentle but firm placement of her hand. "This feels bad. But maybe they are just weird. Get this done, get the cash, and you can spend the next 3 months thinking about how odd this all was, while paying your rent." As she walked Alex forward, Ombra launched into her description of her issue. The vast majority of the data center seemed to be web servers, with most of the cabinets filled with 10 machines cabled up to a top-of-rack switch. These network devices were then cabled back to the main core, which her new client indicated was in the furthest and darkest of the rows. Because of course it was. The servers were communicating with the top-of-rack switches fine, and the TOR's connections back to the core switch were all functional as well. According to Ombra, Stefan had done most of the physical install himself, while she had handled configuration. Judging from the tight wrapping and clean cable distribution, Alex had to admit Stefan did good, professional-looking work. The entire setup was much better organized than most data centers she had seen. As they walked along, Alex took notice of the servers and switches. No vendor labels, no markings of any kind. Jet black, many with an odd crimson light on the inside. Prototypes, perhaps, but even prototypes usually had the vendor's logo. Reaching the far end of the last row in the data center, Ombra waved her thin arms between 2 large devices. One she recognized, a waveguide core switch model 10,000X. She had seen hundreds of them early in her career when they were the height of technology. Now they were a relic, purchasable only secondhand via eBay and other auction sites. If Antica was struggling with its funding, this was a clear sign of it. Cabled up to the waveguide was a machine unlike anything Alex had seen before. It took up the full space of the last cabinet and radiated waves of heat, a pulse that moved in time with a red tide of light that ran up and down the hundreds of network ports on its front surface. 2 thick cables ran back to the waveguide, the same red lights crossing back and forth through each. "What is that?" Alex asked, as much to herself as Umbra. The tall woman was gazing up at the device as it throbbed, looking at it like Alex would look at Austin's drawings. "The end of decades of work," Umbra replied, the pride in her voice clear through the din. "This is my red packet generator, representing years of work. My final issue has been getting it to communicate properly with this box." She indicated the waveguide, her lip curling slightly. $2,000 on auction, not to mention the delivery. The last link in the chain, the finishing step in the plan, the final nail in— "I get the picture," Alex said, suppressing an eye roll. Red packet generator? Sounded like the latest marketing nonsense. She felt the sweat building on the back of her shirt. "I've worked with the Wave 10,000 before, which I'm sure is why you called me. They can be tricky to configure. May I use your terminal over there?" Umbra stepped slightly aside, making just enough room in the cramped row of equipment for Alex to squeeze past. As she did so, Alex was aware of the odor of her own perspiration, unavoidable due to the heated air blowing all around them. She noticed Umbra gave off no such scent. A pocket of cool temperature surrounded the woman, dry air laced with the faint smell of dust. "It's just a draft," she told her nerves. "Get to work." Alex rested her fingers on the keys, the red cursor on the terminal blinking back up at her. Just over her shoulder, she could feel that same lower temperature air as a slight exhalation of breath tickled the back of her neck. "You going to stand over me while I do this, Miss Umbra?" Alex did her best to keep her tone even, but she was sure her frustration and unease crept in there. "That is my intention, yes," Umbra said. "I have much invested into this design. It is necessary that I be involved. Is that going to be a problem for you, Miss Queen?" "Won't matter to you if it is, I'm sure." Alex turned back to the screen. "I'll just get to work here. Sooner I'm done, sooner I'm gone." With her client's icy breath and gaze a constant presence, Alex quickly worked through several issues with the Wave. The box was notoriously fickle and hard to configure, which had created a lot of opportunity for her through the years. There were few techs in New Portland with a certification for this box, most having long since retired. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind drifted into the work. For a short, blissful period, there were no rent payments due, no missing support payments or maternal judgment, no tall, thin woman leaning over her. Just problems and solutions paired for once. Striking the enter key with gusto, she laid to rest the last of the misconfigurations. Umbra seemed to pick up on this flourish, leaning even further in. One last issue. Alex stood, forcing the taller woman a bit back out of her space. "Your Wave has got a bad line card, slot 3 here. I need to pull that out and move these connections." Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Umbra frowning and almost fidgeting with energy. Whatever the woman had planned, Alex felt like just another obstacle. The pale woman gave a nod and stepped a single pace back, allowing Alex just enough room to work. She disconnected the cabled connections and moved them to ports on other cards, willing her hands steady. If she rushed, she would lose track of what went where. Stefan had taken the time to cable things up nice and neatly, and Alex wanted to respect the care he had shown. Moving the final cable, she eased the card out, allowing it to rest on the long, thin rails that slid out of the waveguide like a shelf. With a few clicks, the card slid free, leaving the 2 rails exposed, stabbing out into the narrow passage like knives. Behind her, Umbra let out a sigh loud enough to be heard over the whine of the fans. Cleaning up the cables into a nice, tight bundle, Alex cried out as the sharp rail sliced into her thumb, raising a deep cut. Instinctively, she brought her finger to her mouth, meeting Umbra's eyes as she did so. The woman almost stared through her. her gaze fixed on the tiny crimson trail running down the side of her right hand. Her breath frozen in her lungs, she watched as a pair of dark pupils followed her blood's slow, meandering descent down to her wrist with a hungering intensity. Alex slowly moved her left hand, her own eyes never leaving Ombra's stare. First, she felt for the lump of cash in her front jeans pocket. Good, that was the whole point of this insane affair. Whatever this woman and Antica Incorporated were up to, she no longer cared. Her job was done. She slowly eased her hand to her back pocket, palming the small knife she kept there. You are all set. Connections should work now. I'll be going, Alex said in a voice she barely heard. She realized she was rubbing the blood across her shirt, Ombra's gaze trailing her hand as she did so. Alex moved to her right in the narrow passage, reminding herself that one quick squeeze by Ombra, and she would have a clear path to the door. Don't run, she told herself. Play it cool. As she stepped forward, Ombra moved to block Alex's path, her spindly limbs spreading across the narrow passage. The woman slowly pulled her eyes away from the blood to look Alex in the eye. A small smile crossed the pale face as her arms stretched toward either side of the aisle. Unfortunately, Miss Queen, I don't think you can leave just yet. The rasp in her voice was a mixture of metal shavings and dust. The hell I can't, Alex said, gripping the knife behind her back tighter. Her legs spread and her arms grasping equipment on either side, Umbra reminded Alex of a web. She tried to peek around to see if Stefan could see her, but the far doorway seemed lost in crimson-tinted shadows. Do you know what it is we do here at Antica Group? The woman asked, her eyebrow arched. Alex could feel her fear mixing with frustration. Her options for avoiding a confrontation seemed to be evaporating. She planted her feet. If this was going to get physical, she wanted to be ready. Umbra loomed over her, almost seeming larger, more substantive. Don't know, Alex said, keeping her voice steady. Don't care. I need to leave. Locally, we are a company of one, the woman continued, as if Alex's insistence meant nothing. 2, if you count poor Stefan. If you checked our website, you'd see we are in the food research business. This is true, I am looking to provide new food products to a very ancient and select group of people. Alex could feel her pulse in her eyes, her heart thundering in her chest. Yet she was frozen, the ice of her fear and anger rooting her to the spot. Specifically, Umbra hissed, vampires. Vampires? Alex's grip on the knife grew so tight she worried she'd break the handle. Her arm shook with the effort to keep it behind her. Inside, she could feel the vaults within her swinging open, carefully stored emotions leaking out. For this crazy bullshit, they waste my time? Take me away from Austin? Force me to deal with my mother? Drive to this creepy-ass church for some nut jobs? Her internal rant slowed to a crawl even as the river of anger continued to run through her unchecked. In front of her eyes, Umbra grew to great heights. Her legs and arms stretched further, the woman's gaunt face filling in as she loomed ever higher. The loose suit jacket now tightened to constrain the muscled figure. Only the smile remained unchanged, a crooked grin now far above her. I have a knife, Alex said, the words feeling as small as she did. Her lungs felt empty, her muscles like sponges. People will look for me. The woman raised an eyebrow, the smirk unchanged. I see your weapon, Alex. I am not concerned. And no one will look for you soon enough. After my foolish call to Timecast, we chose more carefully this time. No need to worry about that blood of yours, delicious though it might be. It's not what I want. Umbra nodded toward the red packet generator, its crimson pulses marking the space between them. Much has changed since I went to sleep. Most of all, the blood of you humans. It used to be so palatable, a delicacy, really. Now your bodies are so filled with unnaturals. The smirk on Umbra's face drained away, replaced by a look of disgust. Coloring dyes, preservatives, high fructose corn syrup. During my last feeding in the 1950s, I found I could barely stomach the taste. I awake again, and now I find it's even worse. I vomited for days when I tried last year. That poor priest upstairs, dying for nothing. Father Brennan? Alex felt icy fingers compressing around her heart. Such a sweet man, whose kind, strong hands had once held little Austin safely within them. The last pillar of decency against the desperation of the neighborhood, taken from them as food. Just for his blood? Alex said through her teeth. Umbra was lifting her head, moving her gaze more often to the red packet generator, looking upon it with pride, shifting her focus. Holding the knife steady, Alex waited for the right moment. With any luck, she'd only have to wound her. It was never about the blood, silly girl. You humans always have it wrong. It's the emotions within. Anger, rage, hatred. That's what keeps us going, sustains us. Your blood is just the delivery agent. Alex watched as her opponent's eyes spent more and more time away from her. She counted in her head, determined to strike with the knife on 3 and hoping there was an opening to run. On 1, she gripped her weapon firmly. On 2, she thought of Danny, tapping her anger at him for strength. On 3, she swung. Umbra caught her hand without even looking, without even breaking stride in her speech. She continued, pulling Alex off the floor with one arm. After my vomiting spell last year, I decided to research. In the past, I would have gone to the library, but in the modern age, the library is right there for you on these computers of yours. I suppose not all change is bad. I learned a lot. I've always been a quick study. Biting her tongue hard enough to draw blood, Alex thrashed in the woman's grip. She swung her legs in a series of kicks at Umbra, yet her feet barely seemed to make an impact, as if she were striking at cloth. This internet of yours is a treasure, Umbra continued, Alex shaking in her grip. So much anger, oceans of hatred and rage, just waiting to be harvested. A bounty that would never run out. Her patience seemingly depleted, Umbra thrust Alex into the nearest cabinet, her back smashing painfully against the metal doors. Alex slumped down to the deck, further blood pooling from her mouth. That is what my invention is for. The rasp came from above. It generates red packets, little data modules that invest themselves inside your machines. Oh, how you humans love your machines. My red packets will absorb all the delicious anger and rage you people pour onto your keyboards every day and bring them back here, to me. Alex gaped at Umbra as she struggled to her feet, using her hands to brace against the equipment on either side of her. Her knees shook, her back howled in pain, yet the woes of her body were drowned out by the vortex of anger and confusion within her mind. It was all true. It had to be. Even if she doubted seeing the woman transform, ignored the pain as she was lifted off the floor, the steel in Umbra's gray eyes told the tale. This was a vampire, and her machine was real. Why? Alex gasped, her right hand still gripping the knife. Just to feed you? Hardly. The pride and confidence in the vampire's voice was all the more galling. 1 hour's time on the web would be all I'd need for a decade. But this will let me store this rage, and then deliver it via the internet to others of my kind. For a hefty fee, of course. Wow, Alex rasped. Blood dripping from her lip, a bitter laugh escaped forth. Getting rich off your own people, you really are a vampire. Too true, I suppose. The smile across Umbra's face was chilling. She stretched one long, spindly finger out to the red packet generator and flicked a switch. With a thunderous hum, the machine throbbed into life, crimson light pulsing. Now, turning back to Alex, she bared her teeth. I can always have Stefan replace this line card you called it, later. Umbra narrowed her eyes as she flowed forward. As slow as mist, she advanced on Alex. I can still go. Alex hated how scared she sounded, how much her hands shook. Yet her mind kept bringing her the image of Austin asleep in his bed, waiting for her. I don't need the money. You can keep it. One look in the cold gray eyes of the vampire told her all she needed to know. This wasn't about the money. It was about what she knew, what she'd seen. Umbra would never let her leave. Alex could feel the sweat pouring off her now, powered by her anger throbbing within her. Beyond the web of Umbra there was Stefan, the door, and the way back to Austin. Don't feign being scared with me, Alex. Umbra shuddered as she spoke. I can smell your anger from here. Oh, it is delicious. Escape was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. She balled her fists, drawing the warm, damp air of the data center into her lungs in ragged breaths. Backed into a corner yet again, just like with Mom, with Danny, with every damn thing. With a cry of rage, Alex thrust the knife toward Umbra's exposed chest, lurching her body forward with the force of her attack. Her arms seemed to flow toward her opponent in slow motion, her eyes moving up Umbra's body, her hopes fading at the sight of the woman's confident smile. Her blade crumpled as it made contact, folding as if made of foil. Carried forward by the motion of her attack, Alex fell to her knees. A good try, Umbra said from above her. But even if that had been a stake, it doesn't work that way. You are a very angry woman, young Alex. This close, your rage gives me a strength no weapon could pierce. A bony set of fingers grasped around her damp shirt, pulling Alex to her feet. She could see the veins in the vampire's neck throb, smell the stale, chilled air of her breath. With a sneer, Umbra shoved her, sending her stumbling backward. Her arms flailed at the cables and equipment on either side of her, trying to regain her footing. The vampire surged forward in a silent, smooth motion. Icy hands closed around her neck, gently applying increasing force. The pressure was everywhere now, both without Alex and within. Spots danced before her eyes as she clawed uselessly at Umbra's wrists. Don't be afraid, Alex. The vampire's smile grew wider, revealing the sharp alabaster fangs hidden within. That's not you. Be angry. I want you to hate me. Hate me for all the people I'm hurting by killing you. All the people you love who will never see you again. Umbra's words pushed through the winds of pain and fear, running through her mind, bringing images that flew through her thoughts like debris in a maelstrom. She could see her mother, older and even more bitter, now completely alone and with no one but Austin to pour her issues into. The rage whirled like a vortex inside her, thinking of her angel in that fate, without her to save them. All because of Danny, who would still be in Austin's life for all the good that would do either of them. Now he would be her boy's only example of how to face the real world. He would teach him how to cheat, how to use excuses and laziness as a compass. Yet as her hands tightened their grip on the iron of her attacker's wrists as the rage ran through her to Umbra's visible delight, she knew neither Danny nor her mother was the real villain here. The real enemy was Alex herself, as it always had been. Her choices, her judgments, her weaknesses, her failures. She shook uselessly, spots floating before her eyes, partially obscuring the vampire's grinning face. The entire scene became colored with reds and blacks, the shadows of her anger and rage. Then a new color crossed her vision. Freed during the struggle, the cool blue of a cell phone screen tumbled from her jacket pocket, falling in a slow arc beneath the outstretched arms strangling her. As the device brushed Ombra's chest, the woman shrieked in pain, releasing Alex and sliding several feet away, smoke black as night trailing from the site of impact. Alex fell to her knees, wheezing as she struggled to pull air into her lungs, her throat in agony. Over the rush of her own pain, she could hear Ombra's howls lowering in intensity, the woman seeming to recover from whatever strange effect the phone had caused. Through blurred vision, Alex stared at her cell as it laid face down on the deck of the data center, the cool blue now just an outline surrounding it. Through lamination, Austin stared back at her. Rendered as a stick figure in simple crayon, he stood on the boat he had drawn, 2 dots for eyes and a broad smile on his face. Alex was portrayed on one side of the grinning boy, his father Danny on the other. They were each holding his hand, and with a smiling sun above them in the blue sky, Austin looked at them both with love. Not the love one adult had for another, complex structure built across years, filled with compromises and agreements. Rather, the love of a young child to a parent. Simple, pure, unconditional, the complete opposite of hate and anger. Hearing the rasped breath of Umbra returning, Alex scooped up the phone and held it in front of her like a talisman. The vampire screeched at the sight of it, one spindly arm flying across her eyes. Her maw of teeth screaming in rage, Umbra drove forward, one talon-covered hand outstretched. Lowering her shoulder, Alex pushed into her attacker, ignoring the pain of the woman's claws slicing through her arm. Feeling the icy chill of her foe's body pressing against her, she planted her boots against the deck. Thinking of Austin, she drove Umbra back. 1 step, then 2. There was a moment of resistance. Then a blinding light shattered her vision as a wave of force thrust her backward and onto the floor. Blinking against the spots in her eyes, she gasped at the impossibility unfolding before her. Impaled upon the pair of empty line card rails, Umbra was dissolving. Her distended limbs shuddered as they crumpled into dust, fractures running through her skin like cracking ice. White paste ran from her eyes and down her gaunt cheeks as they melted, while long teeth fell from her mouth like leaves in the fall. A hiss emerged from the vampire's chest cavity before it burst forth, showering Alex and all the equipment around her in a spray of thick, hot blood. Falling to her knees and emptying the contents of her stomach upon the floor, Alex felt her skin burning as the drops of ancient blood seeped into her skin. They marked her clothes and pooled upon the deck plates, mixing with her vomit and a growing pile of ash. Untouched by all, her cell phone rested upon the white tiles of the data center floor. Austin's laminated picture proudly displayed upon its back, a perfect circle of pristine tile forming around it, the power of his artwork somehow pushing the cinders and residue away. Her hand shaking, Alex reached past the small device to trace her fingers within the damp pile of powder that only moments before had been hands wrapped around her throat. A shadow fell across her as she knelt on the hard data center floor, the fine particles of Umbra's remains trailing through her fingers like so much sand. In exhaustion, she pulled her gaze up, looking past the broad legs that stood across the narrow alley between the cabinets, like a colossus. Past the heaving torso and folded, muscular arms, she stared into the face of Stefan standing over her, mouth agape, and tears running down his face. "Finally," he whispered, his voice almost audible over the whirring hum of 1,000 server fans. "After all these years, finally free." A strong hand reached out and Alex grasped it almost instinctively. Dampness drying on his cheeks, Stefan managed a shy smile, strands of dark brown hair falling across his eyes. He pulled her to his feet with little effort, with a gentle care that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "Thanks," Alex said, her mind still whirling. She looked down at the pile of ash at her boots, the tops of the tiny dunes blowing in the data center's wind currents. None of this seemed real. I didn't mean... I mean... I had no idea." "You couldn't," Stefan said, releasing her hand. "I am so sorry. I wanted to help you. I wanted to tell you. Her control over me was absolute." She could see the shame and frustration written across his face, a reflection of the expression she found too often upon her own. The angry helplessness of a person who just couldn't catch a break. Alex reached a trembling hand over to the red packet generator, flicking off the main power switch Umbra had engaged with such pride. The machine ground to a halt, red lights dimming in pitch with the descending whir of a dying engine. "She's gone now." Her voice sounded tired to her, fighting to be heard over the noise of the data center. "It's over." But the dark pit in her stomach reminded her it wasn't over. With gritted teeth, she remembered that she still had past due bills to pay. Mom would still be a daily factor in her life, and the shocking events of the night were sure to complicate things. She knelt, fishing her cell phone away from the pile of ash on the floor. Austin's stick-figure face smiled up at her, and as her tears fell upon the lamination, she found herself smiling as well. Everything in her life wasn't anger. She still had Austin, and Austin still had her. Together they would keep their boat in the water. "You smile," Stefan said, pulling Alex from her thoughts. His speech had a foreign lilt to it now, a hint of Italian she had not detected before. "I'm glad you're safe, and I owe you my life. I wish I could repay you, but I am lost." She looked up at him, clad in simple dark pants and a plain white buttoned shirt. He could be anyone from anywhere, yet the bewildered look on his face told the story. He had no more idea of who he was than she did. If Umbra had taken him in the 50s, he should be in his 70s by now, yet he didn't look much past 25. "What do you remember?" Alex pushed the phone into her pocket and walked down the aisle. Stefan politely made room, then settled in behind her. "Is Stefan even your name?" "I don't know." His voice was strong, but laced with worry. "Everything is fog. Maybe it is my name, maybe it is not. I think I can recall being a painter. I can remember only an easel and an open window, a blue sky." As they cleared the final pieces of equipment in the long alley, Alex eyed the door to the stairs. Austin was up there, as was her life, a life she might want to approach a different way, maybe with a bit less anger. She turned to face Stefan, the worry growing in his eyes. "Miss Queen," his voice shook, I have no right to ask you of this, but you need somewhere to stay," Alex said, smiling. Time to find answers, a second chance. Relief washed over his face like a tide, his brow unfurrowing as he released a sigh into the stale, warm data center air. "I have a spare room and a cot at the office," Alex said. "For tonight, anyway. I think we can work something out, Stefan." There was a warmth that grew within her as she watched the fear depart from his gaze. It was a pleasant feeling, and one she could get used to. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, brushing his hair back with his hand. "I will find a way to make this up to you, Miss Queen. I swear it." "You can start by calling me Alex," she said, motioning toward the door. Pulling it open, she felt the cooler air of the stairwell flow over her like a baptism. Painter. Without warning, her mind brought up her worries about Austin's cake and the pile of decorating books stacked on her desk. "Tell me, Stefan," she said, taking the first steps and hearing her voice echo throughout the staircase. "Ever hear of Thomas the Tank Engine?" He gave her a confused expression, but returned her smile when she laughed. Though she was exhausted, as she ascended the stairs and left the dark and crimson confines of the data center behind her, Alex Queen found the strength to laugh a little more. We hope you enjoyed this audio short story, Blood Packets, by D.H. Dunn, narrated by Amy Kaczynski. For more of the author's work, go to his website, dhdunn.com.